We've all most likely asked ourselves hard questions about God, and perhaps sometimes these questions have seemed too cloudy to tackle on our own. If you are sincerely looking to find answers to your questions, you will want to read this book, The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. The author uses his journalist investigation skills to tackle the following objections to Christianity. Since evil and suffering exist, a loving God cannot. Since miracles contradict science, they cannot be true. Evolution explains life, so God isn't needed. God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. It's offensive to claim Jesus is the only way to God. A loving God would never torture people in hell. Church history is littered with oppression and violence. I still have doubts, so I can't be a Christian. What makes this book unique from other Christian apologetics books is how the author seems to take us into his in-person interviews, giving us minute details about his observations throughout and into his own thought process. Each chapter feels like a different experience because you are hearing from a different person each interview. Each person answering Strobel's difficult questions tackles a topic uniquely, shares interesting experiences, and introduces topics that will leave you wanting to research further on your own. Fortunately, Strobel provides helpful resources for further study at the end of each chapter and also includes questions for reflection. At Girl Talk Apologetics Book Club, these questions were great starting points to the conversations we were able to have each meeting. We had the privilege of hosting a Q&A with Lee Strobel and asked him questions related to this book and other topics, which I encourage you to watch next. Especially if you are someone that wishes you could take a course or pursue a degree in apologetics or evangelism. At the end of our Q&A, Lee Strobel shares scholarship opportunities and more information on that. During that Q&A, I asked Lee Strobel a question and he shared information that he plans on updating this book with in the near future. Before I share a short clip with his answer, let me confess I had not yet finished reading the last pages of this book as I listened to his answer in the Q&A. I did notice mostly everyone in the Q&A was very moved during this moment, and although I was moved by it as well, it didn't fully impact me until I finished reading the last pages, which spoke further about Charles Templeton. This book begins discussing the experience of Charles Templeton, an ex-evangelist who walked away from his faith in God. Here's what Lee shared with us that was not in this book currently, and after this clip, I'll share with you how it impacted me once I finished the book. I know you hinted at this throughout the book, but I was curious about where you were at on your spiritual journey when you wrote this book. I wanted to see if you can go into detail about that.
Yeah, I was a Christian when I wrote the book. The way it started was I was at an event in Banff, Canada, with Mark Middleburg, who's my ministry associate for more than 30 years. And we were doing a live Q&A at a church, kind of an outreach thing, taking all questions about God and so forth. And a guy stood up and he said, "What do you think of Charles Templeton's book, Farewell to God?" Well, I didn't know who Charles Templeton was. I didn't know that he was the #1 agnostic in Canada, that he was the most famous skeptic in Canada, and was the former pulpit partner with Billy Graham, and who had lost his faith essentially at a liberal seminary. And so I said, I've not read it. I don't know anything about it. This guy got really mad, and he said, "Well, how dare you come to Canada and you haven't even read this book by our most famous agnostic?" And he was really angry. So afterwards, I went down to the local bookstore and I bought a copy of Farewell to God, and I read it, and I thought, man, first of all, my heart goes out to Charles Templeton, and he raised some very legitimate issues in his book. And so I wanted to interview him, and I thought, how do I do that? And so I called the publisher trying to get his contact information, and I could never hear back from the publisher. And I tried some other things. I couldn't get in contact with them. And then this is back when the internet was just starting, kind of late 90s. And I went on a new thing called Google, and I typed in Charles Templeton, Toronto phone number, and his phone number came up. And so I picked up the phone and I called him. I said, is this Charles Templeton? He said, yes. I said, well, you don't know me, but I was just reading your book, and I'm going to write a book about tough questions about God. And I was wondering if I could come talk to you about your book. And he said, well, come on up. And so he lived in a high rise in Toronto, and I lived in Chicago. I didn't have any money, so I didn't have money for an air ticket. And so my wife and I got in a car and we drove from Chicago to Toronto. And we spent the night, and the next day we went to his high rise, and my wife stayed in the car and prayed the whole time. And this was about 5 or 6 hours that we were talking. And so she stayed there and she prayed, and I went up and I did this interview with Templeton. I had that famous moment when he broke down and cried because he said he missed Jesus, which I still have on tape. I still have the tape of that. And so, it was an incredible experience, and that became the backbone of the book. And if I can just add what has happened since then, because the book ends with me sending a manuscript off to him. Well, I ended up getting a letter back from his wife, Madeline, who was his third wife, by the way. And Madeline thanked me for sending the manuscript, said I read it to Charles. He's nearly blind now. He had Alzheimer's. He was beginning to die. And she said he really appreciated it, and he thanks you for the book, and so forth. So I said to my friend Mark, well, let's go back up to Toronto and see if we can have another conversation with him. And then we got the news that he died. But what I found out later, and this is interestingly, I'm redoing this book, or I'm updating it, and it's coming out next March, I think, with the updated edition. So I tell the end of the story in the new book, but the end of the story is his wife Madeline, who is a deist. She's not a Christian, but a deist. She said that when he was on his deathbed and about to die, he said, Madeline, can you see them? She said, what are you talking about? Can't you see them? They're here in the room. She said, what are you talking about? The angels, they've come for me. I'm going with them. I'm going to heaven with them. The angels are here for me. You don't see them? They're right here in the room. And so there are those who believe that he made a private peace with God in his own way before he died, and that he is indeed waiting for us in heaven. We don't know that for sure, but some people, in fact, there's a Salvation Army captain, a woman who was a good friend of his, and she was at his wake and talked to Madeline, and she's convinced that he made a private peace with God and that he's in heaven. Also, Greg Laurie wrote a book recently called Billy Graham, The Man I Knew, and I told him about this, and he included it in his book, and he's convinced that Templeton came back to faith, or came to faith. We don't know what his situation was. But anyway, that's kind of the rest of the story. And that's going to be in the new edition of the book that comes out next year. But I thought I'd tell you about that. Yeah. Boy, that's a long way of answering your question.
It's not. No, not at all. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
Some people are commenting in the chat that brings them tears to their eyes.
Yeah, it does to me too. I mean, because I love this guy. I mean, Charles Templeton was a very winsome person. I think that's why he was so successful on television, because that came across to people. They sense his warmth and his authenticity and his honesty. And I remember when I was driving away with Leslie, she said, when I was telling her about the whole experience, and she said, sounds like you like him. And I said, I do. So my heart had gone out to him, and I did find out that Billy Graham visited him. I think it was after I was there, and they had dinner, and Billy Graham prayed before dinner, and Madeline said that was the first time that prayer had happened in that apartment. But they had a great, he loved Billy Graham. Charles Templeton had nothing but the highest respect for Billy Graham. He said he is authentic, he is honest. That is who Billy Graham is. What you see is what you get. he had no problem with Billy. And Billy loved Templeton. Billy Graham said he's the only man I've ever truly loved. So it's hopeful that perhaps someday we'll reunite with Templeton in heaven.
Yes. It was very moving to have heard Lee share this experience about Templeton and then read the last pages, which to me was the heart of this book. This real life experience presses the relevance of searching for answers we may be lacking or someone else may be in need of hearing. People are impacted by these objections one way or another. It's especially tragic to hear about someone walking away from believing in God and struggling to believe because of these objections. It was also moving to see Lee and his wife's concern for Templeton as they prayed for a remaining opportunity for him to hear the answers Lee had gathered throughout his investigation. It's a reminder that we are given a limited amount of time on this earth to gather information and make a decision for what best explains the big questions and objections we have about God. We can learn from Lee Strobel's approach, who even as a believer, seemed to stop at nothing in search for those answers. A life without faith in Jesus is impacted in more than one way. The way we view life or even live our life is impacted and lacks a foundation that can only be uniquely had when we believe in Jesus. Although we don't know if there were other reasons behind Charles Templeton's doubts, what is interesting is that on his last moments of life, he seemed to have faith, sharing a supernatural experience he claimed he witnessed. It impressed on me how intrinsically important is the question of what happens after our life on earth, even if it may be downplayed by many. Some people may argue Christians have no convincing evidence to believe there's an afterlife, but who can really say they have definitive evidence that there isn't one? This is why it's important to take objections and questions seriously and investigate all of the evidence, including the evidence that points to the truthfulness of Jesus Christ. Sometimes some people are not really open about landing where the evidence is pointing to the truthfulness of Christianity, and instead of getting frustrated with people in those situations, we should learn to be wise and patient with them, because they might not realize at that moment that one day they might believe in God, like my friend Ann Sands. She shared her experience leaving atheism and choosing to follow Jesus on another one of my videos, which I will link below and recommend you watch as well. At the end of this book, Lee Strobel shares a short summary of a book he wrote before this one, The Case for Christ. I also look forward to reading that book and others Lee Strobel has written. Please remember to share this video with someone you know, and like and comment to help this video reach more people. Also, please subscribe to be notified of more videos to come in the future.